When we're talking about executing and breaking down the back squat or the competition style squat, predominantly we're talking about low bar, where most people are going to be stronger. You're going to be able to stay more balanced and use more of your muscle, just being a better leverage. So the first thing that I like to do when approaching the bar is I'll take my grip. Being a larger guy, not having the best shoulder mobility, my grip tends to be quite wide. So on a squat bar, I'm about 4 or 5 inches in from each side, and that will still allow me to keep my upper back tight and keep everything retracted, so the bar has a good stable ledge to sit on. I always realize like there's these habits that you don't always realize that you do. Every time I take my grip, I'll come up to the bar and I'll kind of line up the center with my chin so I know I'm exactly in the middle. I think if I use my forehead or anything else, it would just kind of feel normal. I got into a habit of doing that. Once the bar's on my back, thinking about pulling it into you, pulling it around you, taking your stance under, and I'll always unrack with the stance that I want to squat in. You may not always be able to do this in your gym. Say if you're in a set squat rack where you're in between heights and you can't do that, I'd always encourage you to stand narrower, which is going to bring your overall height up, so you can walk out and step out as you step out of the squat rack. So once you've got your grip and your upper back set, your stance set, you will take a brace, which basically entails you take in a large air. You don't want to take in physically as much air as you can and blow everything out. So think about if you're trying to dive underwater, you want to take a deep breath. You're not going to take the biggest breath you can and blow yourself up like a frog. So I'd say about 60-70%. And you want to be able to stay tight here. So if you're taking a deep breath out and extending upwards, your core's not necessarily going to be tight. You want to be able to bring your upper ribs down, so your rib cage level, say if you're here and your pelvis is here, you're not overextending one way. So you're thinking about bracing, bringing your rib cage down to match your pelvis level, then you'll stand out of the rack, take your step back, and I will re-brace from here, pull the bar around my back, take a deep breath, focus my eyes and my head forward, twisting my feet out, and I squat down. Bring the bar down in a straight line. You don't want any kind of J curve, you don't want it swinging backwards or forwards. So knees out, straight down. As you come back up, you want to be driving your upper back into the bar so you can come with as much force and stand tall at the top. I think one of the most misused cues for the squat, you'll hear people say, keep your chest tall, keep your chest up, or keep your head up, which for some people will cause overextension in the lower back or hyperextension. So if someone is already at a straight torso angle and you're telling them to keep their chest up, they're going to overextend and they end up pushing their knees out. So I would rather say just keep your core tight and just brace. Push your knees out, and it's important to keep your head neutral. I find what really helps with myself is just focusing on a point, not usually directly in front of you, but probably down a little bit. So if your angle of your torso is here in the squat, your head should be at the same angle. You're not, trying to crank your head upwards and keep your chest tall the whole way. When we're talking about putting together a squat session or a leg day, basically the first movement that we'll always do will be some sort of squat. Let's say we're off season and you're just looking to build up your squat. The first thing I do myself is loosen up all the muscles that tend to be tight. So for myself, shoulders, pecs, forearms, who you saw at the start. So we were driving the elbows up and through in the front rack position, just trying to stretch out the forearms, opening up the chest with bands. Then we'll move on, warming up and loosening up the lower body. So some hip stretches on the floor, some just stretching and using the quads. And I like to do just basically some bodyweight squats or squats holding a plate out in front of you. So it means you are having to pull back and stay into position. A typical squat session will always tend to start with an empty bar. You kind of have to, feel around, do some slow reps, make sure your positioning is fine. It's basically your chance to do, a bit of an engine check to make sure everything feels good, your knees, your hips, your back. As we're going through warm-ups, depending on what the top sets are for the day, I like to do about 5 or 6 warm-ups through different weights. So you may take 40 to 60 kilo jumps for myself. Say if someone's max squat is 160 and their working weight for the day is 120, I wouldn't recommend jumping up 40 or 60 kilo between warm-up sets. So it's probably somewhere around 20 to 30 kilo. So you're still getting enough warm-up sets to kind of feel through the weight and feel a little bit of weight. If you're taking 2 fewer warm-ups, say you do 2 and then you're straight into a top set, more often than not, that first set that you do, that weight's going to feel really heavy on your back because you're not accustomed to it. So 5 to 6 warm-ups I feel is kind of like the sweet spot. As I say, I'll start off with 60 kilo, may go 100 or 120, up to 160, 180, 240, 280 or 300, and then whatever we're at for working sets, depending on the rep ranges for the day. With the heavy squats, I'll tend to do a couple of working sets, maybe 3. And it can vary greatly depending on what kind of phase you're in with training. So we're doing a competition squat. We do 2 to 3 sets, keeping the weights moving well. You don't want to be breaking down in technique at any point. And I like to save a couple of reps in the tank. So if you're talking RPE, RPE 7, RPE 8, after the main heavy work is done with your squats, I mean, it does take the majority of time and the majority of your energy. Let's say you're putting your focus into the heavier squats, you'll be taking maybe 10 up to 15 minutes between your top sets. Secondarily, more often than not, I like to work on a secondary squat. At the minute, I'm really enjoying paused safety bar squats or paused high bar squats without a belt, just to reinforce your position. You get to work on your quads a little bit more. You can't quite use as much weight, so you're not using a belt, but your core gets to do more stability work. So any chance you can make an exercise harder on yourself, it's worth doing it because it'll pay off in the long run. When the squat work is done, so we usually train lower body maybe every 3 to 5 days. So maybe a variation on the deadlift and then just hammering some legs with some bodybuilding style accessory work. Personally, I love split squats done with dumbbells or a safety bar. That would be to a box or a bench behind you, so one leg at a time, keeping the reps relatively high. And hack squats are another one of my favorites, just for building up the quads. And a couple of working sets. You don't really need to do a hell of a lot of warm-ups there, as we've already done the warm-ups and the sets through the squats. And afterwards, it's important to keep your hamstrings and your posterior chain healthy, so I like to do 3 or 4 sets of hamstring curls. Typically lower body sessions with the mobility, the warm-ups and the rest periods, you'll be looking anywhere between 2 to 3 hours. The heavier sessions, the longer sessions, they tend to take a lot longer and take a lot more out of you, so it may be wise to incorporate your accessories on a separate day if you want to focus on the main work. You can only really go at one movement for so long before you tend to hit a wall with it. And it's equally as important as it is to train your weaknesses as it is your strengths. There's a big school of thought there that everyone thinks, you just continuously hammer your weaknesses, but it's important not to kind of throw your strengths out the window just thinking they're going to stay there, because you're taking any advantage you have over the competition and throwing it away. So it's important to stay strong at the movements that you are strong at as well. So I like to kind of periodize variations of squats between, let's say we're building up to a big squat and we're going to take 12 weeks, say we're peaking. So the first 4 weeks, we may squat high bar or safety bar without a belt. And that would be bare knees or in sleeves. So the weights are going to be minimal, or at least minimal compared to what we will be lifting at the end. The rep ranges are typically going to be higher. There may be a couple more working sets and more accessories thrown in. So we do 4 to 6 weeks on a variation where you can't shift as much weight, and it forces you to work on weaker muscle groups. So let's say a high bar squat or a safety bar squat. After that, we tend to go to more of a competition style. So a couple of weeks we would do throwing in the low bar whilst keeping in the variations there as well. We might still do that in sleeves. Say when you're about 8 weeks out from a competition is a good time to throw on some knee wraps. And you'll just be gradually ramping up the intensity, ramping up the weights. During that time period, you may be spending longer between heavier squat sessions rather than squatting every single week. You may squat heavy every 10 days or every other week and take like a light week or a light session between. So it's something where you can't always attack it in the same way. You do have to kind of differentiate and throw in some different variations. You're looking at someone and they're squatting with a really narrow stance and the knees stay forward. As soon as you try to incorporate your hips or take the stance out, the knees still want to cave in. So basically you have weak hips and you've got weak glutes. So a good way to kind of target that would be a wider stance squat, tempo squats or pause squats. If you have trouble keeping your knees out and keeping your glutes activated, then squatting to a box at about parallel will be a great accessory movement for that. So a box squat to parallel with a wider stance will target your hips and your glutes a little bit more. Another one of my favorites would be the high bar pause squat, which is great for just reinforcing your position. You can't shift as much weight as you would with a low bar squat, so you're really targeting your quads, trying to drive your knees out and keep your torso angle nice and vertical, which is a great accessory for building a huge squat, because often neglected in the competition style. When you are wearing knee wraps, your quads don't quite get as much work, so it's definitely important to keep that in with your training. If you're training in wraps a lot, or if you're training specifically low bar a lot and you know you have weak quads or they need work, high bar pause squats or even front squats from time to time is a great variation to do. Typically, as you're going through week by week squatting, sometimes your arms can kind of take a beating, or your shoulders. So one of my favorites would be the safety bar squat, or the SSB. It takes all the tension out of your upper body and forces you to work more on your positioning. So it keeps you a little bit more upright, somewhere between where a high bar or a front squat would be. But as the weights get heavier on this bar, it tends to want to curl you over, to pull you over, which forces you to push back with your upper back. So if you have a weak upper back, you have weaker quads, or you just want to take some tension out of your upper body so you have better productive bench days, safety bar squat is a great variation, and it's definitely an important factor for building up strong legs. So some of the issues that you kind of see revolved around squats may come down to everyone's kind of got a different perception of depth. Depth in powerlifting is when your hip crease passes your knee line in a parallel plane. So regardless of what people think depth is, that is the definition. So if someone's really struggling with depth, the easiest way to get them to hit depth is strip the weight back on the bar, set up a box literally just below parallel. You squat to that, don't come back up until you feel that box. So you can't cheat it. If the box is there, you have to touch it. If you're not hitting it, you're not hitting depth. One of the worst cues, I think, it works for some people, but you definitely can't tar everyone with this, because everyone's build's different. Everyone has different mechanics within their body. You'll always hear eyes up, chest up on a squat. I've never really liked this cue, because it causes people sometimes to overextend in their back, or to go into basically hyperextension, which can cause a lot of injury, and it can cause people to, the bar path to throw off all over the place. I much more prefer the cue just to breathe into your belt and just to brace and pull your rib cage down. So as we're going through the setup, rather than trying to extend up and back, keeping your chest and your eyes up, I'd rather focus on bringing your rib cage down and keeping your core as tight as possible and just staying in that position. So you're not thinking about doing this at any point. Nothing should be moving whilst you're in motion, whilst you're squatting. Everything's locked in, rib cage down, just tight there. Eyes up, not necessarily. You want to keep everything in line with your spine, so your head will be neutral. Just find a point whether it be on the wall in front of you or slightly lower. It's going to be different for each individual. Fucking bench time, baby. So now we're going to talk about setting up on the bench press. So the first thing we do when setting up for the bench, lay down, and I like to stick my head off the other side of the bench. So head all the way off, that way you can kind of give yourself a bit of room to get into position. So when your head's off the other edge, you take your hands and you find your grip. Myself, I like to use a wider grip. I favor, stronger chest and shoulders, so typically the wider grip that you take, you're going to use a bit more pec and a bit more shoulders. Of course, elbow position and how much you tuck will also play a major role in that, but for the majority of people, a wider grip, it's going to be a little less in the triceps and more in the pecs. So take my grip and I'll use middle finger around the ring. I'll set my feet there, pull myself through into position, and as I'm pulling myself through, I'm wedging my scapula, my shoulder blades back and down, and that's going to bring your rib cage up, so you're in the optimal position to press from, shortening the range of motion. So your rib cage is tall, and as we're doing that, we're going to unrack the bar, take a deep breath. So you're unracking with your elbows. You don't want to pull your shoulders out of position there. So just unrack with the elbows, just pull over with the lats, keeping your chest tall. Before you bring the bar down, you take another deep breath. Keep that in, and we're looking, if you look at, say, the hands on a clock, you think about your arms being at 4 and 8 o'clock there. So at this angle, bringing the bar down. If you're tucking too much, you're over tucking, you're putting too much pressure through your elbow, and your triceps are going to be doing a hell of a lot of work. You're basically going to be switching everything off in your pecs. And as you get down to a certain point, it may work with equipped lifters, but for raw, you don't have that kind of space there, and they end up over-rotating your shoulders, and it can cause a lot of injury. So I want to be bringing down, tall rib cage, a little pause on the chest as you press up, flaring slightly, which is going to push you into a better position to use your pecs and finish the lift in the triceps. So talking about leg drive, basically I like to keep tension through my legs and through my body throughout the lift, probably to about 80%. So when I'm setting up, I'll put myself into position. When my back's set, my legs are already tight. I'm driving my knees out, my hips and my glutes are active, my legs are tight. Unracking the bar, my legs are tight the whole time. So I'm pulling the bar into me. So I'm about 80% tension through my legs and through my body there. As I'm pressing, you're applying that last bit of force, which is going to help pop the bar off your chest back into position. So you're not necessarily thinking about throwing your hips into the air, just driving yourself backwards. If you're finding that your hips are popping off at the bench, then you need to be able to set yourself up tighter in your legs, so your ass can't basically fly off the bench. So I would recommend bringing your feet back. So my grip's set, my feet are set. Pull my back through, take a big breath, extend with the elbows, pull the bar out. So my legs are already tight here, so I'm going to pull the bar in and just apply a little bit more pressure to help pop that bar through. Voila. The bench arch is quite a controversial topic, saying typically larger guys can't arch or get into as good of a position as a smaller athlete, but we do our best. So basically what the arch is doing is just keeping yourself basically out of injury, shortening the range of motion, potentially making the press and the lift a little bit easier, but just preventing injury. So by arching, by lifting up your rib cage, depressing your shoulders, when the bar's in the bottom position, your pecs aren't under as much strain as they would be if you were benching with a flat back in either of your shoulders. So if you were completely flat backed, then you got to think that bar's got to come all the way down. So your elbow is traveling all the way past your body to get that bar to touch. That's a lot of stress here. There's a lot of stress here. With heavy weights, you're putting yourself at risk for potential pec tears or shoulder injuries. Foot placement can be a personal thing. Some people prefer to bench with their heels down. Some people prefer to bench with their heels up on the balls of their feet. And you will see some lifters with crazy arches go as far as basically on the end of their toes. the key thing to remember is whatever you start with is how you want to finish your press. You don't want to be wiggling your feet around, you don't want to be setting up when the bar's already in your hands. So pick one and commit to it. Ideally, I would say everybody should learn heels down first with flat feet, just because it's more stable and it's safer. Some powerlifting federations also require that you have to bench with your heels down, completely flat-footed. So I do think it's important for everyone to learn how to bench with their feet up, be it with the legs straight out, aka a Larsen press, with their feet on the edge of the bench or up in the air. It's important to be able to stabilize your upper body and bench basically with your legs up. Create more stability and also puts you in a stronger position when your feet are down. And it's important just to feel your body. You know how the balance feels, you know where the bar's going, you're in complete control the whole time. And it's better for hypertrophy work. If you're close to a competition, bench with your feet down, bench with an arch, and with a pause, that's how you're going to be competing, so that's how you want to be able to do it. Off-season training, it's important to keep your upper body strong and keep your feet up, and it's going to put you in a better position when you come in to peak for a heavy lift. So typically with bench, I'm currently training everything twice a week. I'll train and bench twice a week, squat and deadlift twice a week. One bench session will typically be a heavier one, closer to a competition style, so a wider grip with a pause. We may do that. Floor press, it may be on a bench, maybe feet down. Another session will be more geared towards bench, but focused on shoulders and triceps and less on a heavy bench. So say if I walk you through a heavier bench session, say I come in, I'm doing a 3x5 competition standard, so that would be with a pause. It'd be at a decent weight and decent percentage. So 3x5, it's the same sort of thing. We're working up, typically jump up 3 or 4 warm-ups. So maybe 60 kilo, 100 kilo, 140, maybe my last one at 160 or 170, then onto working sets. And then we do the 3x5 or so, 3x6, something around that range off season, just trying to build strength, always still trying to maintain technique. Secondary muscles and secondary movements are basically going to come down to, I guess, what's your weakest link. So for myself, I know I need more lockout work, I need more tricep work, so my secondary movement will always be something that targets the triceps more. So we're looking at pin press, close grip with feet up, a spoto press where you pause the bar an inch off your chest, a hefty pause, and pressing out to the top. Just variations that make the lift harder in that area where you're weaker. So after 3x5 or so on bench, we'll go into some more volume work and more sets, more work on the variation where you suck. So you find something that you're terrible at and you just hammer it, basically. That's the best way to do it. Hammer it with volume, hammer it with a decent amount of weight, never let your technique compromise. So triceps, close grip press, so we hit that. Other muscles involved in the bench, you've got your triceps, your shoulders, your lats. Train upper body twice a week, bench twice a week. So we want to be hitting them muscle groups with your bench. After the close grip press, may work onto some shoulder pressing, maybe some pull-ups, some pull-downs, just trying to target all the muscles. We'll do that twice a week. On the second bench session, it may be a lighter session where you focus more on the pecs, so a couple of sets of light bench, so we're talking 8, maybe 12 reps, maybe do it with feet up, so you're working on your stability a bit more. Later on in that session, be working with pec flies, maybe dumbbell press. Triceps would not be a main focus there, as you've already hammered it on your heavy bench day, so maybe just some push downs at the end, but still trying to get in a good amount of shoulder work, maybe some lateral raises and plenty of rows, because basically you can never have a strong enough back, you can never have strong enough triceps. Triceps are going to lock the weight out. That's where you're going to feel the weight through your arms, but your lats, basically, that's your base. That's your base for every lift, for your squat, bench, and your deadlift. If your back's big, you'll be strong. Some of the variations we have demonstrated today, some we've had Stella go through, would be close grip bench with your feet up. You can do this with a pause, you can do it without a pause. It's basically making the range of motion longer. It's making it a more difficult lift, putting the triceps under more stress, and basically you're under more time under tension throughout the whole lift. The rep takes longer, the stroke's longer. It's just going to target your triceps more. It's the same concept that we do with the Spoto press, only that is more so focused on positioning. If you're someone who loses position in the bottom of a bench, you find you can't hold tension. This basically reinforces that if you lose position on a Spoto press, you're not going to finish a lift, you're going to be in a bad place. So you bring in the bar down to about 1 inch off your chest, hold that for a second, and a full lockout. And we do that for sets and reps. So basically, in conclusion, when programming a bench session or trying to plan out what you want to do, you do have to look at your own lifts, and it's important to kind of visualize what's going on. So video them yourself. If you notice you're slow off the chest, you know you need to work on your shoulders and your lats a bit more. If you struggle towards a lockout or things get a bit sticky up there, incorporate more close grip, pin presses, Spoto presses, and then basically work the session out backwards. So you get your main bench work done, secondary, where am I weak? I'm going to attack that for volume, and then make sure you're hitting all the muscles, so your shoulders, your lats and your triceps all within one session, and don't neglect your pec work. So some of the most, I guess, common issues that I do see when people are benching, particularly when they're getting up close to their max, is dumping the bar. You know, people will come down and they're able to bring the bar down controlled to get to the last couple of inches, and they're just hesitant. Dump it, heave it straight back up. If you're pressing in competition, you need to be pressing with a pause, controlling the weight the whole way. And it's something like the Spoto press is definitely going to help you with that. So learn how to control the bar all the way down. Don't lose them less, 4 inches, and let the bar control you. You stay in control of the weight, and your technique will thank you later with a bigger bench. You'll also see some people that prefer to bench within a straight line, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I myself, like we said about the 4 and the 8 o'clock with the arms, bringing it down, flaring slightly, that allows me to use more pecs. Someone's got extremely long arms, maybe benching with a different technique if they want to bench within a straight line, keeping your elbows tucked the whole way, using your triceps a hell of a lot more. You're not necessarily flaring out into your pecs, benching like a bodybuilder style, You'll see bodybuilders benching with a big flare, bringing it down, using as much fibers within the pecs, trying to just build the chest. It's not necessarily the best way to get strong. To get strong, you want to use all the muscles and the technique available to you. But if that does not suit you and you feel that's not a good position, that's not strong, or it gives you issues, or maybe you have had an injury in the past, you find a way around it. If you have to bench flared and stay flared, there's no concrete right or wrong answer. Basically just trying to teach good technique and use every trick that's available to you. Right, so we're on to the last lift in the powerlifting, is the deadlift. Technique-wise, it's the simplest one. You're basically standing up, moving the bar from A to B in a straight line. It's primal. So we talk about how I deadlift. The first thing we want to talk about is your foot stance. So if we talk about width, you want to be probably just inside shoulder width apart. This is going to apply to most people, and just with your toes slightly flared, just around about here. You'll find bigger, thicker guys will probably want to stand a little bit wider, as they've got wider hips, and it'll just allow you to stand and extend the hips all the way through a little easier at the top. So for myself, I'm here, and I like to line the bar up on my midfoot. So what I mean by that is the bar is, as I'm looking down, stood up straight, it kind of cuts the foot straight in half. So you'll probably see maybe 2 eyelets off your shoes sticking out the end there as I'm looking down over the bar. So that is my stance, my width, and how far I am away from the bar. So I'm probably giving myself about 3 inches from my shin to the bar whilst I'm stood up straight. So the next thing what I do is I'll push back into my heels, bending down to the bar, and I'll take my grip. So I'm probably leaving a couple of inches of knurl there on this deadlift bar. Then the next step, once I've got my grip set, take a large breath, brace into my stomach and keep my core tight. So hips are nice and high, big air. So you're thinking about pulling your elbows tight, keeping your lats and your upper back, your traps tight. You don't necessarily want to shrug your shoulders up, but just think about packing your lats in real tight. So that's going to stop your back from rounding whilst you're deadlifting. So grip on the bar, lats are tight, there's tension on the bar there. I will be dropping the hips just a smidge. I've already taken my breath. Then from that point, simultaneously, you're pulling with the back, driving with the legs, and then forcing the hips through to full extension. So it's pulling with the back, pressing with the legs, driving the hips through full extension. All the way through to lockout. Take another breath if you need to. Now let's just repeat that setup again. So if you need to step away from the bar to recreate that whole setup from scratch until you get it right, again, toes slightly flared, bars cutting my foot in half, so my midfoot, weight into my heels, big breath, pulling the slack, getting the lats tight, hips back, and drive through. So it's really important to drive your hips, press with your legs, and pull with your back simultaneously. At no point through the lift do you want to, stop pressing with your legs and just pull with your back. Everything works in conjunction with a deadlift. Everything works together. Your whole body is one. So one thing to talk about is grip. For rep sets, using straps is absolutely fine. Typically when I'm training lower reps, you want to make sure your grip is definitely up to par for pulling the bigger weights. So whether you use a double over, you're only going to be able to hold up to so much weight. Beyond that, we're going to be talking about hook grip or mixed grip. So typically on my warm-up sets, warming up to maybe 220 kilos, we do everything with a double over. You work in your grip, it's a little bit of a challenge. Past that, we'll decide whether we're going to go hook grip or mixed grip. So usually with a mixed grip, like I say, when we're gripping with the bar, we're just outside the knurling, and it's giving yourself enough to drive your knees out into your arms. Usually that's going to give you some tension in the bottom there. With a mixed grip, obviously you have to supinate one hand, and it can feel a little bit lopsided. So to counterbalance that, I tend to shift my underhand out 1/2 inch, and then everything again tends to feel even on the bar when I'm pulling. So for mixed grip, my overhand, I move it outside about 1/2 inch, and what the mixed grip is then doing is basically ensuring the bar cannot roll out of that hand, because this hand has it covered the other way, and vice versa. So when it comes to ways to make your deadlift stronger, some of the variations that I like to use include deficit deadlifts, basically where you're stood on top of a box, making it a longer pull, therefore putting your body under more stress. Your whole posterior chain has to work harder, and you have to maintain a better position. Other than that, we have stiff legs. You can combine the two, where you're doing deficit stiff legs together, or even RDLs if you want to target your hamstrings and keep tension on the muscle a little bit more. One I'm doing a lot in training at the minute, which has actually improved my deadlift quite a lot recently, is the pause deadlift. And that again can either be done off a deficit or off the floor. So to demonstrate the pause deadlift, every part of the setup is identical to a regular deadlift. The only difference is you want to be pausing the bar for a couple of seconds, maybe 2 inches off the floor. So just break the floor with the bar, hold it, maintaining position, keeping your core tight. Your upper back, your entire back really, has to work double time to maintain that position to ensure that the lockout is nice and smooth, which is what we want. We don't want no cat back pulling. So things that you typically see with beginners when they're learning to deadlift is they will do everything right, get themselves into position, and right at the last minute they will sit their hips all the way down to the ground and try and get their back basically as vertical as they can, so they're bolt upright, and it basically looks like a squat where they're grabbing onto the bar. You're not loading your posterior chain, your hamstrings are doing no work, your glutes are doing no work, nothing's tight, and they're trying to squat with the bar. Your knees are way forward over the bar. There's no way that bar can travel in a straight line. With any significant weight on it, the first thing that's going to happen is the hips are going to shoot up, and you're going to be right in a crappy position where where you're going to lose everything that you've tried to do with your setup. So rather than try and pull yourself down into a bolt upright position, you're pushing back into your heels and just dropping your hips just a smidge. You don't have to be bolt upright with your knees sticking way out forward over the bar in order to deadlift. It's not a squat, it's a deadlift, and you're using your entire posterior chain, so just keep your hamstrings tight with that. So for people who have an issue typically locking out a deadlift, it's not necessarily that you have a weak lockout, because the deadlift basically comes down to position. If you're in a good position from the floor and you maintain a good position, you're in a good position to lock out. If you're firing everything at it right off the floor and you lose your upper back rounds, by the time you're at the lockout, the bar's past your knees, you have to fight to get that back into position. So rather than trying to target that and think, right, I need to do more rack pulls, more block pulls because my lockout's weak, it's more so thinking, right, my lockout's weak because my position's terrible, so how do I work on my positioning? Pause deadlifts. Pause deadlifts are a great way to work on your position, because it forces you to maintain and hold tightness with the bar hovering off your floor. Your whole body's loaded, your posterior chain, your quads, your core, your body's basically fighting to stay into position. As you pull through from that, then that's basically going to help you with your lockout. The same thing goes for glute strength. Some people, sometimes they can get their back all the way through the deadlift and they don't have enough glute strength to lock out. Then again, doing the box squats, like we said, will also help develop your hips and your glutes, but also stiff leg deadlifts. Just pushing back into your heels, or RDLs, just building up your hamstring and your glute strength through there is do wonders for your lockout. So building a deadlift session, always go in and warm up. Warm up your hips, warm up your back. Always start with an empty bar. I'll do a couple of deadlifts, a couple of bent over rows, stretch out my lats and do some pull-ups and some dead hangs before going into anything like that. Deadlift session, typically I'll start plate aside and jump up maybe 40 to 60 kilos between warm-up sets, again with the squats and the deadlifts. Similar where I'd like to do 5 to 6 warm-up sets, a little more than I would bench, just because it's more of a high-risk movement. So by the time we're up to working sets, we're talking a deadlift session. Let's say we're off season again, let's pick a 3x5. Heavy deadlifts, it's taxing on the body, it's hard on the body, and it does get you breathing hard. So you want to be taking your time between your warm-ups, and definitely taking your time between your top sets, between your working sets. So whether it's 10, 15 minutes, depending on what you've got to do. If you're doing cluster sets or speed work, a minute, 2 minutes, whatever you need. But so it's hard to kind of get everything done within one session on a deadlift, because your lower back can only take so much of a beating in one session. When you get a lower back pump and it absolutely crushes you. Our company Strom have just released a product called Hydromax, which directly targets lower back pumps, which has helped me get more work in throughout my squat and deadlift sessions, which ultimately is going to be massive towards building a bigger lift. If you can get more work in and you don't get that pump in your lower back and you're able to stay hydrated through your session, it's going to do you wonders. So typically after the main deadlift work, I like to do a variation. Say if we're doing a deadlift back day, a variation on the deadlift. So as we talked about pause deadlifts, reinforcing your position, you're using maybe 30% lighter weight, sticking within the same rep range, whether it be 5 to 6s, get a couple more sets in there. Your back's under a lot of tension as you're holding that weight, probably twice as long with the pause. So a good couple of sets of pause deadlifts will certainly help you there. After the pause deadlifts, if your lower back is feeling strong, I like to get bent over rows. So bent over rows just off the ground, all the way, pulling the bar all the way up, bending over so that when you're at full extension, the bar is basically just hovering off the ground. You're getting a full range of motion, you're getting a full stretch on your lats. No point in doing little short reps. It's not going to get the stretch in your lats that you need. And when you're pulling on big heavy deadlifts, you do round in the back and your lats will round to a degree. So it's important to be strong in that position and reinforce it with bent over rows. Usually after the rows I like to do some kind of vertical pull. So a lat pull down or pull-ups, more of a bodybuilding movement again, stretching the lats, contracting at the bottom. And the only thing left to tick off with a deadlift session would be hamstrings. So we've already got plenty of pull work, plenty of deadlift work, good bunch of sets of hamstring curls to finish the session off nicely. If you want to train your calves, train your calves.